Imagine a world where time itself flows differently, a world where distance is not just a number on a map, but a ruthless tyrant dictating the rhythm of life, love, and death. In this world, the news that could break your heart travels at the speed of an exhausted horse, and the word that could save a fortune crawls along muddy roads in the leather pouch of a mail coach. This is the early 19th century, and in this world, the speed of information was a physical quantity, measured in the endurance of muscle and the courage of men. It was in such a world that a 34-year-old successful artist named Samuel Morse found himself in Washington in 1825, working on a prestigious commission, a portrait of the celebrated General Lafayette. He was at the peak of his career, full of plans and hopes. One morning, a messenger arrived. The rider was caked in road dust, his horse lathered in sweat. He handed Morse a letter from his father in New Haven, Connecticut. The letter contained only a few lines, but they brought the full weight of a slow-moving world crashing down upon the artist. His beloved wife, Lucretia, was gravely ill. Morse immediately dropped everything, his brushes, his palette, the unfinished portrait, and raced home in a state of desperation. He changed horses, switched from one stagecoach to another, urging the drivers on, praying he would be in time. But the distance was relentless. When, after several agonizing days, he finally reached his home, he was met by a deafening silence. His wife wasn't just ill, she was already dead and buried. The news of her sudden illness had taken so long to reach him that he had not even had the chance to say goodbye. That moment, that personal tragedy, became the spark that ignited a revolution. The grief-stricken artist, standing by a fresh grave, may not have known it yet, but his sorrow would become the catalyst that would forever change the speed of humanity. He vowed to find a way to conquer the cursed distance, to kill the time that had stolen his last farewell. This story is not just about wires and dots and dashes. It is the tale of how a brilliant artist, driven by the pain of loss, unwittingly passed a death sentence on an entire profession, one shrouded in romance and deadly risk. It is the story of how invisible pulses, racing along a wire, paved the way to our modern, instantly connected reality, and of those who were crushed beneath the wheels of this relentless progress. To understand the scale of the upheaval Samuel Morse was about to unleash upon the world, one must first dive headlong into that era, into its deafening silence and unhurried pace. At that time, the living lines of communication were people of flesh and blood, messengers, couriers, and stagecoach drivers. Their work seems to us today like something out of an adventure novel, but it contained far less romance than it did a harsh, grueling reality. Imagine a young man, hired by the Postal Service. His workplace is hundreds of miles of broken, muddy roads, dense forests, and desolate prairies. His transport is a horse, as mortal and vulnerable as himself. His cargo is a leather pouch of letters that could be worth a fortune or contain state secrets. And he was responsible for that pouch with his life. The day began long before dawn. He had to check his horse, tighten the saddle girth, and make sure his pistols were loaded. Yes, a weapon was as essential a piece of equipment as a canteen of water. The roads swarmed with highwaymen, for whom a mail courier was a prime target. An attack could happen at any moment, from around a bend, from a forest thicket. Every snap of a twig, every distant cry of a bird, made the heart pound. But humans were not the only threat. The wilderness was home to wolves and bears, and a snake bite far from the nearest settlement was tantamount to a death sentence. The weather was another merciless enemy. In summer, the scorching sun turned the road into a dusty hell, and sudden thunderstorms washed out the tracks until they became impassable bogs. In winter, an icy wind cut to the bone, and blizzards could bury a rider and his horse alive. Crossing rivers was a separate ordeal. Bridges were few, and often one had to ford turbulent streams, risking drowning oneself and destroying the precious mail. At the postal stations, located tens of miles apart. A brief respite awaited, swapping a tired horse for a fresh one, a mug of water, a piece of stale bread, and then back on the road. Sleep was a luxury. Food was simple and scarce. The pay was paltry. It was a job for the hardiest and most desperate of men. And yet, the profession had its prestige. Messengers were heralds, the people who bound scattered towns and settlements into a single whole. They brought news of politics, tidings from relatives, business contracts. Their arrival was awaited with a mixture of impatience and anxiety. For isolated communities on the frontier, the postal rider was the only thread connecting them to the wider world. The economy of the time was entirely dependent on this tortoise-like pace. A merchant who sent a ship with goods to another country might learn of its arrival or its sinking only months later. Stock market traders in New York made decisions based on news from Europe that was already weeks out of date. Governments waged wars without the ability to command their armies in real time. A general could win a battle after a peace treaty had already been signed in the capital, but he simply wouldn't know it. The price of an urgent message was colossal. Major banks and trading houses maintained their own couriers, creating complex relay chains using the fastest horses and the most reliable steamships. But even they could not leap beyond the ultimate limit, the speed of a horse. The swan song, the heroic and tragic finale of this era, was the legendary Pony Express. It was born in 1860 as a desperate attempt to bind together a fracturing nation. California, rich with gold, was separated from the eastern states by thousands of miles of wilderness. The Civil War was brewing, and rapid communication with the Pacific coast had become a matter of national security. The idea was simple and daring: to create a relay of lone riders who, changing horses day and night, would race across the entire continent. The requirements for riders were harsh. Wanted, young, skinny, wiry fellows not over 18. Must be expert riders willing to risk death daily. Orphans preferred. Hundreds answered the call. They took an oath not to drink, swear, or fight. Their equipment was minimal so as not to weigh down the horse. A lightweight saddle, a revolver, a canteen, and a special leather mail pouch, the mochila, which was thrown over the saddle at each station. Inside this pouch were letters wrapped in silk to protect them from moisture. The cost of postage was astronomical, $5 for half an ounce, the equivalent of several $100s today. The Pony Express riders became national heroes. Their route lay through the deserts of Nevada, the Rocky Mountains, and the territories of hostile Native American tribes. They rode under the scorching sun and in icy blizzards. Legends were told of riders like the young William Buffalo Bill Cody, who once rode for nearly 400 miles without rest after his relief rider was killed. This was the absolute limit of human and equine capability. In 10 days, they covered a distance that took a stagecoach a month. It seemed like a miracle, but their feat was doomed. While these brave youths were pushing their horses to the brink, along their very route, men were already driving posts into the ground and stretching a thin copper wire between them. The Pony Express lasted for only 19 months. It was a financial disaster for its founders, but it remains in history as a brilliant symbol of the twilight of an era. Heroic, desperate, incredibly fast for its time, and utterly useless in the face of the coming revolution. But the idea that information could be transmitted faster than a courier was not new. It had been floating in the air long before Samuel Morse picked up his schematics. For centuries, humanity had searched for a way to cheat distance. The ancients used smoke signals and drum beats, but these methods were primitive and dependent on the weather. A real breakthrough occurred in late 8th century France during the Revolution. An engineer named Claude Chappe created a system he called the semaphore, or optical telegraph. It was an ingenious design for its time. On the tops of towers, placed within sight of each other, usually 5 to 10 miles apart, were movable arms. An operator on one tower, using a system of levers, would set the arms into a specific configuration corresponding to a letter or symbol. The operator on the next tower would read this signal through a spyglass and immediately reproduce it for the next tower in the chain. In this way, a message, like an invisible relay runner, could travel hundreds of miles in just a couple of hours. Chappé's network blanketed France and became a vital tool for Napoleon's government. But this system had two fatal enemies: night and fog. As soon as darkness fell or low clouds rolled in, the connection was broken. The world would once again plunge into slowness. The real key to instantaneous communication lay not in mechanics, but in a mysterious and little understood force: electricity. In 1800, the Italian Alessandro Volta invented the first chemical battery, the voltaic pile, giving humanity its first reliable source of continuous current. 20 years later, the Danish physicist Hans Christian Ørsted made an accidental but monumental discovery during a lecture. When he completed an electrical circuit near a compass, its needle twitched and deflected. An electric current created a magnetic field. This invisible link between electricity and magnetism was the missing piece that inventors had been searching for. Now, a signal could not only be sent down a wire, it could be made to perform an action at the other end. Deflect a needle, ring a bell, move a lever, and the first attempts were not long in coming. One of the forgotten pioneers of this era was the Russian diplomat and scientist, Baron Pavel Schilling. While serving in Munich, he became fascinated with electrical engineering and, in 1832, years before Morse's celebrated successes, he demonstrated one of the world's first working electromagnetic telegraphs in his St. Petersburg apartment. His device was quite complex. It consisted of 6 galvanometers with magnetic needles suspended on silk threads. Depending on the direction of the current, the needles would deflect one way or the other. By combining these deflections, Schilling created his own code to transmit letters and numbers. The demonstration caused a sensation. He even laid an underwater cable across the Neva River and successfully transmitted signals, amazing Tsar Nicholas III himself, who ordered a communication line to be built between St. Petersburg and the naval base of Kronstadt. Schilling even conceived of an electrically detonated underwater mine. It seemed Russia was on the verge of a technological breakthrough, but fate decreed otherwise. In 1837, in the midst of preparations for his project, Pavel Schilling died suddenly. With the inventor's death, his ambitious project was buried in the archives of the War Ministry. Around the same time, in 1833, 2 great German scientists, Carl Friedrich Gauss and Wilhelm Weber, built their own telegraph in Göttingen. It was not intended for commerce. The scientists simply wanted a reliable link between the university's physics laboratory and the magnetic observatory, located nearly a mile away. Their system used an induction coil and a mirror galvanometer, which projected a beam of light onto a scale. It was an incredibly sensitive but cumbersome and complex instrument. Nevertheless, it worked flawlessly for several years, proving the very feasibility of transmitting complex signals over a significant distance. The idea was literally in the air. It was ripe. All that was needed was someone who could turn a scientific experiment into a simple, reliable, and cheap product capable of changing the world. And that man, strangely enough, was not an engineer or a physicist, but an artist whose heart had been broken by the world's imperfections. Samuel Morse's return voyage from Europe in 1832, aboard the packet ship Sully, became a turning point. He was still consumed by his grief and his artistic pursuits, but the tragedy with his wife had planted an obsessive idea in his mind. During the long voyage, he overheard a conversation among several passengers about recent discoveries in electromagnetism. One of them, a Boston scientist named Charles Jackson, was demonstrating tricks with an electromagnet. He spoke of how electricity traveled along a wire almost instantaneously, regardless of its length. That phrase struck Morse like a bolt of lightning. If electricity could travel 10 miles along a wire in an instant, why couldn't it be made to carry a message? In his mind, accustomed to thinking in images and symbols, the entire concept was born in a flash. He began frantically sketching in his notebook. Coils, levers, a pencil making a zigzag mark on a moving paper tape. By the end of the voyage, he had a draft of the world's first recording telegraph. He was obsessed. "If it can be done," he told the ship's captain, "I see no reason why it should not be." However, the path from idea to reality proved to be long and agonizing. Morse was a brilliant artist, but his knowledge of physics and mechanics was quite superficial. He settled in New York, living hand-to-mouth in his studio, spending his last pennies on copper wire, batteries, and magnets. His first models were clumsy and crude, assembled from the most unlikely materials. Old clockwork, an easel, parts from broken objects. He struggled alone for years, earning only the ridicule and pity of his colleagues. They saw a talented painter who had lost his mind, trading his high art for some mad scheme with wires. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, in England, the race was already in full swing, and its participants were far better prepared. William Cooke was an enterprising businessman who immediately saw the commercial potential in electrical communication. Charles Wheatstone was a distinguished scientist, a professor at King's College London, who possessed deep theoretical knowledge. Their paths crossed, and they formed a powerful, though highly contentious partnership. In 1837, they received the first British patent for their needle telegraph. Their device was more complex than Morse's concept. It used 5, and in later versions, 2, magnetic needles that pointed to letters on a dial. It was clever, but it required the operator's constant attention to avoid missing a letter. And it left no physical record of the message. It couldn't be double-checked. Nevertheless, their system worked. They found their first major client in the booming railway industry, which desperately needed the telegraph to coordinate train traffic. While Morse was battling poverty and technical challenges in America, Cooke and Wheatstone were already laying the first commercial lines in England. The breakthrough for Morse came when he found 2 key partners. The first was Professor Leonard Gale, who helped him improve the electrical components, suggesting the use of more powerful multi-turn coils. The second, and perhaps most important, was a young and talented mechanic named Alfred Vail. Vail not only invested his family's money into the project, but, more importantly, contributed his skilled hands and engineering ingenuity. It was Vail who refined Morse's cumbersome prototype, making it compact and reliable. He replaced the fragile pendulum and pencil setup with a sturdy lever and a metal stylus that embossed dots and dashes onto a paper tape. And it was in collaboration with Vail that the most brilliant part of the entire system was born: the code. Morse code. Unlike the complex systems of their competitors, it was based on a brilliantly simple principle. According to one account, Vail visited a local print shop and counted how many of each type of letter were in the type cases. The most common letters in the English alphabet, like E and T, were assigned the shortest and simplest symbols, a single dot and a single dash, respectively. Rare letters, like Q or Z, were given longer combinations. This made transmitting messages incredibly fast and efficient. Soon, operators discovered they could recognize letters just by the clicks of the receiving device, making the paper tape unnecessary. The telegraph had found its voice. Armed with a working device and an ingenious code, Morse, Vail, and their financial backers began a desperate fight for recognition. They held public demonstrations, transmitting messages across several miles of wire spooled up in an auditorium. The public was thrilled, and newspapers wrote of a miracle. But investors and the government remained skeptical. For years, the inventors lobbied the U.S. Congress, begging for funds to build an experimental line. They were ridiculed, called mad dreamers and charlatans. One congressman even sarcastically proposed an amendment to fund a line to the moon. Morse was on the brink of despair. The money was gone, and his partners were ready to give up. It seemed the great invention would die before it was ever truly born. Then, on the final night of the congressional session, March 3, 1843, a miracle happened. After long and grueling debates, by a margin of just a few votes, the bill to appropriate $30,000 for the construction of an experimental telegraph line between Washington and Baltimore was passed. Morse, having given up hope, had already gone home, certain of failure. The next morning, the daughter of a friend woke him with the joyful news. He was so grateful that he promised her she would be the one to choose the words for the world's first official telegram. The construction of the line became an epic saga, filled with drama and technical challenges. Morse's initial plan was to lay the cable underground in lead pipes to protect it from vandals and the weather. Expensive equipment was purchased and workers were hired. But after laying several miles, they discovered that the cable's insulation was faulty and the signal wouldn't pass. It was a catastrophe. A large portion of the allocated funds had been wasted. The project was on the verge of collapse. At this critical moment, one of the partners, Ezra Cornell, the future founder of Cornell University, proposed a brilliantly simple and cheap solution. String the wires on poles, insulated from the wood. But what could they use for insulation? After many experiments, Cornell hit upon the idea of using simple glass knobs, fitting them into specially cut grooves on the poles. This solution not only saved the project, but also created the iconic look of telegraph lines that would define the landscape of the 19th and 20th centuries. 40 miles of poles and wires, stretching from the nation's capital to Baltimore, became the road to the future. Finally, on May 24, 1844, the historic moment arrived. In the Supreme Court chamber of the U.S. Capitol, a group of congressmen and officials had gathered. Samuel Morse, now a middle-aged, gray-haired man, sat at his apparatus. In Baltimore, at the other end of the line, Alfred Vail waited in the railroad station. A tense silence fell. Morse's fingers began to tap the key, sending out dots and dashes. He transmitted the phrase his friend's daughter had chosen, words from the Bible. "What hath God wrought?" A few moments passed, feeling like an eternity. And then, the apparatus in Washington began to chatter in response. Vail had received the message and was instantly transmitting it back, word for word. It was done. The message had traveled 40 miles and back in a fraction of a second. The reaction of those present was a mixture of shock, awe, and disbelief. Some still suspected a trick, some clever hoax. To dispel the doubts, the attendees were invited to send their own messages. One of the skeptics asked for information about the political nominations that had just been decided in Baltimore. When Vail instantly transmitted the results, which no one in Washington could yet have known, all doubts vanished. This was not a miracle. It was a new reality. News of the working telegraph spread across the country, but most people still failed to grasp the scale of the revolution. To them, it was an amusing curiosity, a scientific attraction. What was needed was a vivid, dramatic example to demonstrate the practical power of the new invention. And such an opportunity soon presented itself, not in America, but in England, where Cooke and Wheatstone system was already operating on the Great Western Railway. On January 1st, 1845, a murder occurred in the town of Slough. A man named John Towell had poisoned his mistress, and to make his escape, boarded the next train to London. However, he was spotted. The police were desperate. The train was the fastest mode of transport, and it was impossible to catch him. Then someone suggested using the electric telegraph. A clerk ran to the Slough station and frantically began tapping out a message to Paddington Station in London. He described Towell as a man in a long, dark overcoat. The telegraph operator at the other end received the message and passed it to the police on duty at the station. When the train arrived, John Towell was met by a welcoming committee. He was apprehended, convicted, and later hanged. This story had the effect of a bombshell. Newspapers around the world ran screaming headlines. "The wires have caught a murderer." "Electricity in the service of justice." The telegraph was transformed from a scientific toy into a powerful tool. People saw with their own eyes that the invisible pulses could be faster than a criminal, could save lives, and could deliver justice. It was the most powerful advertisement the inventors could have ever dreamed of. After this incident, skepticism gave way to a frenzy. The telegraph boom had begun. A web of wires began to rapidly envelop the world. The first and most faithful ally of the telegraph was the railroad. This symbiosis was mutually beneficial. Railroad companies needed the telegraph desperately to coordinate traffic. Before its invention, trains on single-track lines risked head-on collisions, and scheduling was a nightmare. The telegraph allowed dispatchers to track train movements in real time, issue orders, and prevent disasters. In return, telegraph companies were granted the right to run their lines along the railway tracks, which was cheap and secure. The Iron Horse and the Talking Lightning set out together to conquer continents, becoming the twin pillars of the Industrial Revolution. Soon, the military also recognized the power of the telegraph. Previously, commanders on the battlefield were practically blind and deaf, relying on slow-moving mounted aides de camp. The telegraph changed the very nature of warfare. It received its baptism by fire during the Crimean War in the 1850s. The British and French laid an underwater cable across the Black Sea to their command post in Crimea. This allowed politicians in London and Paris to receive news from the front in hours instead of weeks, and to directly intervene in military operations by issuing orders to their generals. This, however, had a downside. Incompetent armchair strategists often hampered their commanders by making decisions detached from reality. But it was during the American Civil War that the telegraph truly became the nervous system of warfare. President Abraham Lincoln was a great enthusiast of the new technology. He spent countless hours in the War Department's telegraph room, personally reading dispatches from the fronts and issuing orders to his generals. The Union established a special military telegraph corps, which laid over 15,000 miles of lines connecting its disparate armies. This gave them an immense strategic advantage over the Confederates, whose telegraph network was far less developed. War became faster, larger in scale, and deadlier. The telegraph brought about an equally profound revolution in the world of information. Before, newspapers would reprint news from other cities with a delay of days or weeks. With the advent of the telegraph, news of an event in New Orleans could appear in the evening editions of New York papers on the same day. This led to the birth of an entirely new phenomenon, the news agency. Companies like the Associated Press in the US and Reuters in Europe realized they could gather news from across the country and around the world via telegraph and sell it to dozens of newspapers simultaneously. This changed journalism. The long, ornate articles filled with rumors and opinions gave way to a new telegraphic style. Short, concise reports stating only the facts. After all, every word in a telegram cost money. But the most audacious and ambitious project of that era was the laying of a transatlantic telegraph cable. The idea of connecting Europe and America seemed like pure madness. To lay a thin, fragile cable on the ocean floor, at a depth of several miles, across underwater mountains and chasms, over a distance of 2,000 miles. It was a task on the verge of science fiction. The driving force behind this project was an American businessman named Cyrus West Field, a man of unbending will and almost fanatical perseverance. The first attempt in 1857 ended in failure. The cable snapped and sank. A second attempt, a year later, also nearly failed. But after several breaks and repairs in the open ocean, the cable was finally laid. On August 16, 1858, Queen Victoria sent a congratulatory telegram to U.S. President James Buchanan. The world rejoiced. New York City held massive celebrations with fireworks and parades. It seemed a new era had dawned, but the joy was short-lived. After a few weeks, the signal grew weak and then disappeared entirely. The cable's insulation had failed. The project was a crushing fiasco. Field was ruined and ridiculed, but he did not give up. It took another 7 years, a civil war, and the development of new technologies and more advanced ships to finally lay a reliable cable in 1866, one that would connect the continents forever. From that moment on, the world's financial markets were linked into a single system, and diplomacy reached a new level of speed. Globalization did not begin with the internet. It began with the clicking of a telegraph key on the floor of the Atlantic. Against the backdrop of these grandiose achievements and tectonic shifts in the global economy and politics, another, quieter, but no less dramatic story was unfolding. The story of how an entire profession died. For the messengers, couriers, and riders of the Pony Express, the telegraph was not a miracle of progress, but a harbinger of the end. Their world, built on muscle, endurance, and courage, was crumbling under the assault of an invisible force racing along wires. The collision was brutal and swift. There is no racing against lightning. When the first transcontinental telegraph line reached Salt Lake City, connecting the east and west coasts of the United States, the Pony Express service, which had so recently seemed the pinnacle of speed, died that very same day. Its owners simply sent a telegram to their agents, ordering them to cease operations. The heroic riders who had risked their lives on the prairies were no longer needed. A telegram from St. Louis to California now arrived in minutes. It took a rider 10 solid days of riding to cover the same route. There was no competition. With the arrival of each new telegraph station, the routes of stagecoaches and couriers grew shorter, and then disappeared altogether. Imagine an experienced mail courier, a middle-aged man who has spent his entire life in the saddle. He knows every trail, every dangerous river crossing, every water source on his route. His work is dangerous, but he is proud of it. He is a respected man, a link between worlds. And then one day, he rides into town and sees workers driving poles into the ground and stringing a wire. At first, he pays it no mind. But a few months later, he learns that his route is being discontinued. His services are no longer required. Everything he knew how to do, everything he had dedicated his life to, had become meaningless and obsolete overnight. The fates of these men varied. Some tried to find other work, becoming farmers, teamsters, or gold prospectors. Others, unable to find their place in the new world, turned to drink or became outlaws, using their knowledge of the roads for criminal purposes. There were no unions to protect them, no retraining programs. Progress simply swept them from its path like dry leaves. Their personal stories, their dramas and tragedies, were lost in the general excitement over the new technology. They were transformed from heroes of the prairie into the unemployed, living relics of a bygone era. But as is always the case, the death of one profession gave birth to others. The courier was replaced by the telegraph operator. This was the new elite of the working class. Telegraphers were highly skilled specialists. They had to possess perfect hearing, quick reflexes, and a steady hand. They knew the international language of dots and dashes. They were the keepers of secrets. The most important government dispatches, stock market reports, and personal tragedies passed through their hands. Their work was stressful and demanding. They sat in their small offices at railway stations and in city centers, and their fingers, tapping out Morse code, were the fingers that controlled the nerve impulses of an entire nation. And in the final stage of delivery, the baton was passed to the telegram boy. These nimble teenagers in uniform, on bicycles or simply on foot, delivered the printed telegrams from the station to the recipient. Their appearance on a doorstep always evoked mixed feelings, joyful excitement or a chilling dread. Telegrams were sent only for the most important and urgent reasons. a birth, a wedding, or a death. Thus, the telegram boy became the new messenger, the last human link in a new, almost entirely automated information chain, replacing the brave rider on a lathered horse. So, what became the legacy of that spark, born in the mind of a grief-stricken artist? The telegraph did more than just speed up communication. It rewove the very fabric of space and time. It created what we might today call the global village of the 19th century. For the first time in history, the financial markets of London, Paris, and New York began to operate in sync. The price of cotton in Liverpool instantly affected plantations in the American South. The need for time standardization arose. Previously, every town had its own local time, determined by the sun, but to coordinate train schedules and telegraph networks, time zones had to be introduced. The world began to live by a single clock. The telegraph changed the language of diplomacy, making it more tense and responsive. Sometimes this led to disaster, as in 1917, when British intelligence intercepted and deciphered the so-called Zimmermann telegram. In it, the German foreign minister proposed a military alliance to Mexico against the United States. The publication of this telegram enraged the American public and became one of the main reasons for the United States' entry into World War I. A single, short electrical signal had changed the course of world history. The principles established by Morse and his contemporaries, encoding information into a binary system, dots and dashes are, in essence, ones and zeros, and transmitting it over a network, laid the foundation for all subsequent communication technologies. The telegraph was succeeded by the teletype, which printed letters, then the telex, the fax machine. Alexander Graham Bell, while working on improving the telegraph, accidentally invented the telephone. Guglielmo Marconi, experimenting with electromagnetic waves, created the wireless telegraph. Radio. Ultimately, the fiber optic cables that carry the internet today are the direct descendants of that first copper wire strung between Washington and Baltimore. The ghost of the old telegraph lives on in every email we send, in every message on our phones. The story of the messengers and the telegraph is a timeless tale of the inevitability of progress and its human cost. It reminds us that behind every great invention, behind every technological revolution that brings immense benefits to humanity, there are not only creative geniuses, but also nameless victims, those whose professions, skills, and entire way of life are rendered obsolete. Today, as we stand on the threshold of new revolutions driven by artificial intelligence and automation, this story from the 19th century sounds more relevant than ever. Samuel Morse lived to a ripe old age, showered with honors and fame. He had realized his dream. He had conquered the time and distance that had once brought him so much sorrow. He connected the world, making it smaller, faster, and more intimate. But in the triumphant clicking of telegraphs around the globe, the hoofbeats of the last messengers fell forever silent, carrying with them into oblivion an entire epoch, an age when the greatest speed was the speed of a horse, and the greatest currency was the courage of a man who dared to challenge the endless road